Welcome back to the History of the Papacy Podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey.
On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" Now, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise."
And this was from the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37 from the New International Version, read by none other than Garry Stevens, which was a completely cold read. So one take, give him a big round of applause for that.
Well, it was one take too. Woo, woo, woo.
Well, I want to welcome everybody back, and I especially want to thank Garry for jumping in yet again for this 10th anniversary series. This episode was initially going to be just a little short interlude during an upcoming episode where I was really trying to do a quick explanation of why there's this geographical gap in Second Temple Jewish archaeology, just right smack dab in between Judea, the area around Jerusalem, and the southern Levant, and then the Galilee, sort of the western area of the Sea of Galilee, in the central area of the Levant. And as I got into actually putting my thoughts down, a quick explanation started to turn into a long explanation, which turned into basically a full episode. So here we have a full episode on the Samaritans. The Samaritans and how they fit into Second Temple Judaism is probably something I should have delved into a long time ago, especially in this series, but we're getting to it now. And there is nobody better to have involved in this episode than the one, the only host of the History in the Bible podcast, Garry Stevens. How are you this fine day, Garry?
I am excellent, Steve, and I'm glad to be here because I'm a world authority on the Samaritans.
All right, excellent. And that's what we need. I think unfortunately, I mean, we'll get into this. There aren't many Samaritans left to this day, but they still are there. Now, Samaria was home to the Samaritans, and that's the same Samaritans who feature prominently in the parable of the Good Samaritan and the Samaritan woman at the well from the Gospel of John. The Samaritans of the first century BC and CE AD inhabited the area that was pretty closely corresponds with the ancient northern kingdom of Israel. And there was a great deal of enmity between the Samaritans to the north and the Judeans to the south. Kind of seems like there's still kind of a bit of enmity, even though there's only, I think there's less than 1,000 left.
From what I read, there's less than 800.
And they all fairly much live in the Nablus area, I want to say, of the Palestinian Authority, and a couple here and there spread throughout Israel. And then there's a diaspora, but there's not even that big of a diaspora, really.
It seems to be, again, from my reading, the diaspora is almost non-existent. There's maybe a few people. It's probably literally a handful.
And they're one of those people that I learned a big word for it. And I'm probably going to make a fool of myself. Endopic you can only become a Samaritan by being born a Samaritan. You can't convert to Samaritanism. So that kind of limits your pool.
You're just asking for a genetic bottleneck, aren't you?
Yeah. And like we were saying, the Samaritans of today, they're just a tiny shadow of what they were. They were a major force 2,000 odd years ago. Now a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people that really is really on the verge of extinction, just because of that basic need that you have to be born a Samaritan to be a Samaritan. Now, these Samaritans, they practice a religion that is really quite close to that of the Jews, modern Jews even, but especially Second Temple Jews. The Samaritans have a sacred text that is a version, their own version of the Pentateuch, which we'll get into a tiny bit later on. As scholars use the Samaritan Pentateuch as a text to learn more about the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Septuagint versions of the Old Testament. It's a good comparison and contrasting tool. And the Samaritans have a temple worship that they still have to this day, and it's the same temple. Their focus is not the Temple of Jerusalem, and it was never the Temple of Jerusalem. It was the temple at Mount Gerizim, which is in traditional land of Northern Kingdom of Israel. And this is something that, now that I've done a little bit of reading, they, at least in the first century, it does not appear that they used a synagogue type system, but they may have developed it later. If you look at archaeological sites of like what they would, and I'm leaning heavily on the Jonathan Adler book that I've mentioned in previous episodes. He has maps. So if I'm reading those maps wrong, that's my fault, not dear Professor Adler's mistake. But if you look at those maps, there are not ruins of synagogues in that Samaria region. But that's something maybe we can look into more and discuss more. But as far as I can tell from that time period, they did not use synagogues, or at least it wasn't something, I guess, analogous, you might say, to a typical Judean synagogue. But then again, it could have developed later on in history, especially their temple gets destroyed at some point. I think it got destroyed a couple of times throughout history. So they may have seen the Jews to the south started the synagogue system. It looks pretty good. Let's go for it. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Just a word on synagogues. I'm just thinking, my recollection about synagogues is that the very earliest synagogue we know about comes from Egypt and the early Ptolemaic period. And it seems synagogues were used for three main functions. One was for teaching. Second was prayer. And the third one, they functioned as sort of meeting halls for various events. Now, apparently the synagogues in Judea had two of those functions, and the foreign synagogues had two of those functions, but they were different. So apparently the synagogues outside Judea were used for slightly different purposes to the ones in Judea. But they seem to be a very handy institution.
Yeah, and I've seen that sometimes synagogues were a town would have a synagogue, or maybe 2 or 3 synagogues, depending on how big the town is. But it also could be a clubhouse. The shoemakers would have their synagogue. And is that one of the differences between the diaspora and the Judean?
I think it is. I can't remember exactly, but that sounds perfectly reasonable.
And they would, these synagogues, it really is. It's if you think of the way a modern church functions, it really does have both of those. It has the temple and the synagogue functions combined up. It's a clubhouse, and it's the liturgical worship space where the Jews of the Second Temple had that split up. You had the temple. That's where the liturgical functions happened. But most people weren't going to go to the temple. I think there was requirements that you had to go there a certain amount of times. But I mean, as a practical matter, more than 200 miles really is probably more than anybody could ever go, more than a handful of times in their lives. If you even lived 50 miles away, convert that to your favorite metric number, but you get the gist of it. Anything more than a week's walk away is probably not anything you're doing with any frequency.
Well, no, given that 95% of the population was involved in agriculture, you're going to be either tending your herd or planting your crops or something almost all the time. And I would have thought the only time that, say, the head of the house, the man, could really take time off, maybe in winter, something like that. And of course, it would depend where you live. And after the diaspora, I mean, there are a lot of Jews in Italy. They're not going to be going back to Jerusalem for the 3 mandatory festivals every year, are they? So I suspect it'd be more like the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. Maybe you'd do it once in your life, and you wouldn't be able to afford it. I mean, the cost to go from Italy to Judea, whew.
Yeah, I think we are so accustomed that you just hop in an airplane and, if somebody's from England, they just go back to England, and it's, maybe they could go twice a year potentially from Australia or wherever, where that I think anything more than a week or 2 journey away, which was really a couple of 100 miles, a couple of 100 kilometers equivalent, is, I would have to imagine for most people, that was just completely out of the realm of possibilities. We're going to give a really short recap of a really long history. And from the Old Testament, the Israelites returned to Canaan from slavery in Egypt. They set up tribal associations all over the southern Levant. Eventually, the people demand a king in order to keep up with the surrounding tribes. God gives them one. There's what you would call the United Kingdom of Israel, and that lasts through 3 kings and then splits up. The northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah in the south. The northern kingdom roughly corresponds with what we would call Samaria. The southern kingdom roughly corresponds with Roman Judea in the Second Temple times, the late BCs, early CEs. I'm totally mixing all of those up. BCE, CE. We'll keep people on their toes today.
Yeah.
And then, so from the Old Testament and the historical record, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom of Judah was able to hold on a little bit longer, 150-ish odd years or so. If you want to learn much more in detail, go to Garry's first season of History in the Bible, and you can find out much, much more about this, especially the text and the history. That was the Neo-Babylonians, if I'm not mistaken, who conquered Judah. Which I don't think was there a dramatic difference between the Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, Paleo-Babylonians?
Well, the Assyrians, I mean, they're very closely related to the Babylonians. The Assyrians had their legendary reputation for fierceness, of course, which the Babylonians never did. They were closely related peoples.
Then we read in the Old Testament text that the Babylonians took all of the people of Judah into exile and brought them back to their capital in what is modern day Iraq. And supposedly they also repopulated the land of Judah with outsiders. And almost certainly they didn't take everyone. And almost certainly, again, they didn't completely repopulate the land with outsiders. I mean, that's just, to me, that seems logistically impossible. And then what's the purpose to that?
Surely they would have taken the intellectuals, the leading elites, maybe some of the soldiers, that sort of thing, some merchants. But I can't see them taking the farmers, really.
No, they have their own farmers.
Yeah, exactly. They've got lots of their own farmers. You want to take skilled tradespeople.
And that's what these Mesopotamian empires did. Often they would take the ruling elite of conquered peoples back to their homelands. And they really did have, there was tons of reasons to do that. The brain drain aspect, take the best so that the best aren't there to be fomenting revolts and building up their own empires. Then you, like Garry was saying, you bring the highly skilled people to build up the core of your own empire. You blend the upper crusts of the conquered peoples together, and then you blend them with your own upper crusts. So you make a new upper crust that everybody's connected to each other. And then, we see this process in many of the books of the Bible, and it may not be completely historically accurate, but it gets to the big picture, especially in the book of Daniel, where, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they would all get to, those were up and coming upper crust Judeans that get plugged into the core empire's administrative class. And under any other circumstances, they would be owned properties. Who would not want to be completely connected into that? You can get rich, you can get prosperous, happy. Why not?
Yes, we certainly have, I think, records discovered only in the past 50 years of one particular Jewish family in Babylonia, and they became a merchant family. And apparently we have records through 5 generations. So these people, they weren't running around in clanking chains. They were fully integrated, as you said, into the elites and the skilled classes. And from the records we have, they're doing pretty well.
And then so there's about 80 to 100 years of exile in Babylon. Then the Persians, the next big empire to hit the scene. Would you say that that's accurate, 80 to 100 years? I've seen a lot of different numbers for the Babylonian exile, but that seems to be about the most common.
Oh, I can tell you that. Let me look at my little chart.
All right. Which is available on historyinthebible.com.
That's right, for free. Yeah, you're looking about 80 years. Absolute tops.
Cyrus comes along and he's fairly enlightened, if not completely enlightened, but probably not nearly as brutal as the Babylonians. Cyrus allowed the Judahites or the Judeans to move back to Judah and what we'll start calling now Judea. But surprise, surprise, there's still people living there. And the people living in the land are seen as inferiors to the fancies coming back from Babylon, and they're seen as backward country bumpkins. And imagine a lot of them, in a lot of ways, they weren't the aristocracy who was sent into exile, becomes even more sophisticated because they're in contact with the most sophisticated empire at least in the ancient Near East world, and potentially in the entire world at that time. And then they have to go interact with the hoi polloi.
Mm. And what's more, they were coming from the legendary Fertile Crescent, 2 huge rivers, cosmopolitan, you can get a coffee anytime you like. And now you have to go back to this semi-desert place which has never had a coffee.
And I think what you were saying about 80 years is pretty darn close to 5 generations. I would say that, or maybe, in modern days, maybe 4, but I could see back then where that could be 5 generations.
Could be. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah make clear that a lot of the Jews in Babylonia did not want to go back at all. They describe, I think, 3 attempts to get the Jews back after Cyrus said, go home, go home. And it took them something like 60 years to get a substantial population. So they were very reluctant to leave Mesopotamia.
And just think about it in your own circumstance. I think I have relatives that, both being Australia, the United States is predominantly what you really could call a diaspora population, and that most people are not native to the land here. My relatives came about approximately 5 generations ago. What would happen if I went back to the village that they were from in Italy, and I don't really speak the language, or I don't know the culture? How would I know the culture? I haven't had any connection to it, and the family hasn't had connection to it in 100 years. But then I'm going to go over there and lord it over them and tell them how to act, because, like you said, I've had coffee before.
Yeah.
I can get a bagel anytime I want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Judean religion of the exiles developed in many ways that is different after the interactions with the Persian religions and those religions of the East. And we see many innovations in practice and the theology of the Judeans, like the transition of the Hasatan into from a neutral character who's the prosecuting attorney, essentially turns into an evil character throughout that time. So you see that there's some fundamental things that change with the religion, and that post-exilic religion of the Judeans who repopulated Judea is really the basis for Second Temple Judaism. Post-exile, Second Temple Judaism became the religion of Judea. Up north in the former kingdom of Israel, different things were going on. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah both had versions of the Israelite religion that was related to Canaanite religions of the area. They both started to develop a sacred literature, recording shared stories, legends, teaching tools. When the kingdom split, their religion also evolved in different directions. I mean, that's just natural. They ran parallel to each other. But you think about it, the Judeans wanted their temple to show the grandeur of their crown, their shining city on the hill, Jerusalem. And their culture. The people to the north had their own temple at Mount Gerizim. They wanted to show off their culture and their shining city on the hill. So when did this split happen between the Jew and the Samaritan? Maybe that split was in the works for a long time. And that's kind of where I lean on that it was a split that there was a lot of similarities, but they're starting to grow in their separate directions. A lot of the splits, or the hints rather, in the splits that happen is in the similarities and practices between Jews and Samaritans, and then the differences in the similarities between the Samaritan Pentateuch and then the Proto-Masoretic text, and then just to throw in with the diaspora, the Greek Septuagint. And that formal split really may not have happened until as late as we were saying, the 1st or 2nd century BCE, with all of the reforms of the Maccabeans and all these huge changes that happened in Second Temple Judaism, changes that did not happen in the Samaritan religion, and that changes that may have not entirely happened in the diaspora Judaism, and really maybe never a formal split. Maybe these two parallel versions of a similar religion just kind of went on, and they parallel evolved in their parallel and to the point where it was clear that each another was the other. Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Yeah. Gee, I'd like to know the earliest reference to a Samaritan. I suppose there's no literature. And I was thinking, there seems to have been a definite trend in scholarship in the past 20 years to attribute to the Maccabeans, or at least Maccabean time, a lot of changes or developments in Judaism, which scholars hadn't really thought of. But there seems a definite tendency, things which 60 years ago people thought, took place anywhere from Solomon's time to the late Two Kingdoms phase. They're now thinking, maybe this only happened in Maccabean times.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. There's a lot in that Jonathan Adler book looks at the archaeology and the textual evidence, and he tries to go back as far as he can go at certain things archaeologically and then follow them up textually. And some things go way back and they can be traced back a long way, but then other things really don't start to pop up until the Hasmonean period. And the Hasmoneans, which we'll get into in this section, they really had to build up a whole national mythology from the ground up, because they had basically fell into empire almost by accident. This Maccabean revolt and new Jewish kingdom that comes about, we've discussed it a little bit in other episodes, and I'm sure most people are aware that after the Maccabees won their revolt, they spread their power north into Samaria and then to the western area of the Sea of Galilee. And they even looped around that a little bit. They looped around the Dead Sea. I mean, that's a pretty massive kingdom. I mean, it's not Seleucid big, but it's not Ptolemy big richness. But I mean, to be able to carve out a little bit of a kingdom in between those two behemoths is nothing to sneeze at.
No, not at all. And they were coming from a very small area, because I know that the Persian province of Yehud was pretty much just a couple of dozen miles around Jerusalem. It was tiny. And what the Maccabeans basically did was expanded outward to be about the same as, say, Solomon's kingdom, which would have been so that means they would have increased its area by about a factor of 8 or 9.
If you look at the map, you can go find maps of the Maccabean kingdom or the Hasmonean kingdom at its biggest extent, and it's all of the modern state of Israel, more or less. Maybe not that little tip of the triangle at the bottom. And it goes into Lebanon. It goes into a little bit of Syria, a good half of Jordan. So it was especially, I think that's more impressive back then, even because you have the Seleucids who are all over that, and the Ptolemies who, they were constantly fighting over that area. So the Maccabeans and the Hasmoneans, which is sort of shocking, I think, to most people, is they made inroads in in the areas that they conquered by converting people to their form of Judaism. And they converted people in the Galilee region, but it seems like they didn't get that deep into Samaria. I think you can see in the Galilee, that's where Jesus was from. That's where his early followers were from. And there was many observant Jews in that area. And that area of the Galilee was not a traditional area where Judeans or even the Israelite religion and culture existed in the past. But then it became a thriving center of Second Temple Judaism. For some reason, though, the Hasmoneans didn't make many inroads into the area of Samaria. And you can see now why there was really no love lost between the Samaritans and the Jews of Judea, because they just were so similar. And they're really the Judeans are trying to change these Samaritans over from what they think is a perfectly fine version of the Israelite religion over to this reformed version of their religion. Or they probably, reform is always in the eyes of the beholder. but they would probably see it as a massively changed version of their religion, even though to us on the outside, it seems very much a marginal difference. They would have seen that as a huge difference, and that's why they basically hated each other's guts. Yeah, absolutely. I think the Serbs and the Croats is probably an excellent modern analogy.
Yeah, it's rather like the Monty Python Life of Brian thing, where the groups are arguing about the Popular Front of Judea versus the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front, that sort of thing.
Or that Dr. Seuss book, it's where they buttered the bread on the top versus the bottom. I mean, that was obviously meant to show the exaggeration of that sort of thing, but you get I think the people out there get the gist of that sort of conflict of the people who are the closest to each other are going to have the most points of conflict because they care. Here's a little speculation that I had, and I wonder what Garry has to say about that. I think the Galileans, they really, probably with the converts' fervor, took on Second Temple Judaism. And then to get to the holy and the important spots of Jerusalem, they routinely had to travel through Samaria to get to Galilee. So there must have been some accommodation made by the Samaritans to these Jews from the north to pass through. Or maybe there was complete enmity. I don't know. But you would just think that naturally, if you have a lot of people traveling through your land, you're going to try and make a little dough off of them from travel expenses and lodging. And I think we do see that. The question would be is why were the New Testament writers so accepting of Samaritans that they basically put these two stories in there that paint the Samaritans in really good light? They don't bash the Samaritans and even show how they act better than the Jews.
Yeah, very true. Now, I was just wondering, when Jesus is traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem in his final week or so, doesn't he make an effort to avoid Samaria? So instead of traveling due south, he actually crosses the other side of the Jordan and comes down the other side of the Dead Sea? Or am I just imagining that?
That does sound familiar. And then he would have had to have gone through the Decapolis and then Nabatean areas that wouldn't have been particularly friendly either.
Yeah. But I can't remember in that story whether he did it to avoid the Samaritans or he did it to avoid... No, the whole thing was a Roman province, wasn't it? So he wasn't avoiding one of the Herods. I don't want to mislead anyone. I'd hate to invent an entire story about Jesus.
We can dig into that, though, and maybe we'll do a little bit of a follow-up episode. Or if somebody out there wants to send in a comment, that would always be appreciated. Hey, before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the Papacy Diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.